August 15th, 1945. Across Japan, thousands of pilots gather around crackling radios, listening to a voice most have never heard before, their emperor speaking in an archaic dialect barely comprehensible to common soldiers. But the message is unmistakable. Japan has surrendered. For the kamikaze pilots who survived to hear these words, men trained to sacrifice everything for the homeland, the announcement brings an eerie silence. Behind them, scattered across dozens of air bases from Kyushu to Honshu, sit thousands of aircraft, Zeros, Hayabusas, rocket-powered Ohkas, crude wooden Tsurugis, many designated for special attack missions, all armed, fueled, and waiting for an invasion that will never come. This is the story of what happened to those machines of war, the ghost fleet that never flew its final mission. When Emperor Hirohito's voice faded from the radio, a strange paralysis gripped Japan's remaining air forces. The surrender had come so suddenly that operational orders remained in effect at bases across the home islands. At Chiran Air Base in southern Kyushu, young pilots who had written farewell letters just hours earlier now faced an impossible reality. They would live. The specially modified aircraft they had trained to die in, Mitsubishi Zeros loaded with 500-kilogram bombs, their fuel tanks filled for one-way trips, sat lined up on runways that had seen 439 men depart and never return. But even as Japan's military leadership absorbed the shock of defeat, rogue elements refused to accept surrender. In the chaotic days between August 15th and the formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd, reports emerged of unauthorized kamikaze sorties. One account, though debated by historians, describes an attack on August 20th, 1945, when officers from a Manchuria-based unit allegedly launched a final unauthorized strike against Soviet armored units. They reportedly called themselves the Shinshu Fumetsu Special Attack Corps, the Divine Land Immortal Squadron. Whether this mission occurred as described or became embellished in post-war retellings, it speaks to the desperate defiance some units felt in those final days. What remains certain is that the organized kamikaze campaign had consumed nearly 4,000 pilots and damaged or destroyed hundreds of American ships. What American forces discovered when they arrived to occupy Japan was staggering in its scale. Intelligence estimates had predicted perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 aircraft in reserve. The reality was far more disturbing. Warehouses, caves, abandoned railway tunnels, even camouflaged positions hidden in forests. Everywhere the occupation forces looked, they found aircraft. Not just conventional fighters and bombers, but purpose-built instruments of self-destruction. There were 852 Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohkas, the rocket-powered flying bombs that American sailors had nicknamed Baka, Japanese for fool. There were prototypes of the Nakajima-Ki 115 Tsurugi, crude one-way aircraft built from wood and non-strategic materials, designed to be mass-produced in workshops across Japan at a rate of 8,000 per month. The landing gear on these machines was designed to drop away after takeoff, to be recovered and reused. The pilots would have no need for it. At Atsugi Naval Air Base near Tokyo, American engineers found row upon row of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the aircraft that had once dominated Pacific skies, now sitting abandoned, many with propellers removed. Japanese commanders at this base had ordered the propellers stripped in the final days, a desperate effort to prevent unauthorized attacks that might provoke American retaliation. The sight was both eerie and telling. Aircraft grounded not by enemy action, but by their own leadership's attempt to enforce a surrender many pilots refused to accept. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Occupation Forces, made his dramatic arrival at this very base on August 30th, days before the formal surrender. It was a calculated risk, Tsurugi had been home to kamikaze units, and the war was technically not yet over. But MacArthur understood the power of symbolism. His message was clear. American authority was absolute, immediate, and inescapable. The occupation's first priority was demilitarization, and nowhere was this more urgent than with Japan's suicide aircraft arsenal. The policy came directly from the Potsdam Declaration. Japan was to be rendered permanently incapable of waging war. All military aircraft were to be destroyed or secured for examination. No exceptions. The task fell to specialized Navy and Army units who fanned out across the Japanese archipelago with orders to catalog, evaluate, and dispose of every flying machine they could find. What unfolded over the following months was one of history's largest deliberate destructions of military hardware. At bases across Japan, American engineers established staging areas where captured aircraft were sorted into three categories. The first category, perhaps 36 machines total, consisted of the most technologically significant examples. These would be shipped to the United States for detailed study. Among them were several Ohka rocket planes, a few intact Tsurugis, and examples of Japan's most advanced conventional fighters. The second category included aircraft deemed suitable for limited operational testing in Japan before destruction. These machines would help American forces understand the tactics and capabilities they had faced. But the overwhelming majority, thousands upon thousands of aircraft, fell into the third category. Immediate destruction. The methods were brutally efficient. At some bases, bulldozers simply crushed aircraft where they sat, reducing Zeros and Hayabusas to twisted wreckage. At others, demolition teams used explosives, setting charges that turned entire flight lines into fields of scattered aluminum and shattered wood. Photographs from the period show American soldiers standing atop piles of wrecked aircraft, some 3 or 4 planes deep, monuments to industrial destruction. Yet not all aircraft met their end through American hands. In a revealing twist, Japanese ground crews were often ordered to carry out the destruction themselves, under American supervision. Former kamikaze mechanics found themselves dismantling the very machines they had lovingly maintained, removing engines, stripping instruments, cutting through airframes with torches. For men who had prepared these aircraft for sacred missions, the work carried a particular anguish. One post-war account, its details impossible to verify, describes American soldiers observing the destruction at Tsurugi, jumping onto aircraft and kicking them with their boots, mocking the Japanese with contemptuous words about fighting with worn-out toys. Whether this incident occurred as remembered or represents the emotional memory of humiliation many Japanese felt, it captures the profound sense of defeat that accompanied watching their last symbols of resistance reduced to scrap. The destruction was not random or haphazard. It was systematic, recorded, and absolute. Navy teams maintained detailed inventories of every aircraft type, its location, condition, and method of disposal. Nothing was left to chance. The goal was not just to eliminate Japan's current air capability, but to ensure that even the memory of how to build such machines would be difficult to reconstruct. But a select few aircraft escaped destruction, preserved for a very different purpose: intelligence. In the closing days of 1945, American transport ships departed Japanese ports carrying carefully crated aircraft, some complete, others in pieces. Their destination was stateside technical facilities where teams of engineers would conduct exhaustive examinations. The Ohka proved particularly fascinating to American analysts. Despite its limited combat success, only a handful of ships sunk or damaged during the entire Okinawa campaign. The concept of a rocket-powered, human-guided missile was decades ahead of its time. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio and Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland disassembled several examples, studying their solid-fuel rocket motors, the unusual cruciform tail design, the massive aminal warhead. The lessons learned would influence American guided missile development in the early Cold War, though the human guidance component was mercifully eliminated. Similarly, the Tsurugi prototypes offered insights into just how desperate Japan's situation had become. Constructed almost entirely from wood, using engines salvaged from obsolete aircraft, these machines represented industrial desperation refined into doctrine. American intelligence analysts noted that Japanese planning documents projected mass production in thousands of small workshops across the country, a theoretical production target of several thousand per month that would have made systematic bombing nearly impossible. That this weapon never entered service in meaningful numbers was, from the American perspective, a stroke of extraordinary good fortune. The intelligence harvest extended beyond captured hardware. American interrogators sought out surviving kamikaze pilots, particularly those with technical backgrounds. These interviews revealed tactical details that had been only dimly understood during combat: approach altitudes, attack patterns, the psychological preparation pilots underwent. Some of these men, trained as engineers before the war, provided detailed technical information about aircraft modifications, fuel mixture ratios, even the specialized ignition systems used on the Ohka's rocket motors. While most of Japan's kamikaze aircraft vanished into scrapyards and intelligence reports, a tiny fraction survived for an entirely different reason. They became witnesses. In the decades following the war, as Japan grappled with its wartime legacy, several aircraft were preserved as artifacts of remembrance, controversial monuments to sacrifice, nationalism, and loss. The most significant of these preservation efforts centered on Chiran, the small town in southern Kagoshima that had served as the primary departure point for Army kamikaze operations. Of the 1,036 Army pilots who died in special attack missions, 439 flew from Chiran. In 1955, 10 years after the war's end, a statue of Kannon, the Buddhist goddess of mercy, was erected at the former airbase. It was the beginning of what would become a much larger memorial effort. By 1975, the movement to memorialize the kamikaze pilots had gained sufficient support and navigated sufficient controversy to open the Chiran Peace Museum for kamikaze pilots. The museum's founders faced a delicate challenge: how to honor the young men who died while acknowledging the horror of the war they fought in. The solution was to focus on the human stories, the farewell letters, the personal effects, the photographs of teenagers in flying gear who would never grow old. Central to the museum's collection are 4 restored aircraft: a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, a 1943 Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, a 1944 Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, and a Mitsubishi Zero recovered from the seabed in 1980. The Zero's recovery was itself a small drama. Divers located the wreckage in relatively shallow water off the coast, covered in coral and marine growth. The painstaking restoration revealed not just the aircraft's structure, but evidence of its final moments. Impact damage suggesting a controlled dive rather than the erratic spiral of a plane shot down. Today, Chiran receives over 500,000 visitors annually, making it Japan's most visited kamikaze memorial. But the museum remains controversial. Critics argue that its presentation veers toward glorification, emphasizing the pilot's sacrifice while minimizing the aggressive war that necessitated such desperation. Defenders counter that the focus on individual stories, young men writing final letters to mothers and sweethearts, humanizes an often incomprehensible aspect of war without endorsing the political system that created it. Beyond Chiran, other surviving kamikaze aircraft found homes in museums around the world. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum preserves one of only 4 surviving Nakajima Tsurugi prototypes displayed in the Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center. There, protected by climate control and conservation expertise, it stands as a testament to engineering desperation. Museum labels carefully contextualize the aircraft, explaining both its technical characteristics and the desperate circumstances that led to its creation. An Ohka Model 22, one of the jet-powered variants that never entered combat, also resides at the Smithsonian, the only one of its kind still in existence. Unlike the solid-fuel rocket models that saw limited use at Okinawa, this version was powered by a Su-11 motorjet engine and boasted a range of nearly 280 kilometers. Had it entered service in numbers, it might have posed a far more dangerous threat than its predecessor. Instead, it serves as a what-if artifact, a glimpse of a nightmare weapon that development delays mercifully prevented from becoming reality. Back in Japan, the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, the controversial memorial that honors all of Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, maintains its own collection of military artifacts at the attached Yushukan Museum. Here, the presentation is markedly different from Chiran's. The Yushukan's exhibits lean heavily toward nationalism and revisionism, presenting Japan's wartime actions in a context that many international observers find deeply troubling. Among the displays are kamikaze artifacts and aircraft components, presented as examples of ultimate devotion to the nation. The preservation of these aircraft raises profound questions that Japan continues to grapple with. How does a nation remember a chapter of history that involves sending its own children to certain death? How do you honor individual sacrifice without endorsing the aggressive militarism that demanded such sacrifice? These questions have no easy answers, and the surviving kamikaze aircraft, whether displayed at Chiran with somber reverence or at Yasukuni with nationalist fervor, remain focal points for these ongoing debates. In the end, the fate of Japan's kamikaze aircraft mirrors the larger story of the nation's post-war reckoning. Most were destroyed, reduced to raw materials that would help rebuild a shattered nation. A few were studied, their secrets extracted and repurposed for a new era of conflict. A tiny fraction were preserved, transformed from weapons into witnesses, their presence forcing uncomfortable conversations about duty, sacrifice, and the human cost of war. For every aircraft that survived, thousands were lost to the cutting torch and the scrap heap. Today, rust and memories are all that remain of the vast fleet that sat waiting on August 15, 1945. 9,000 machines built for death, preparing for an invasion that never came, instruments of a strategy that combined technological innovation with human desperation in ways the modern world still struggles to comprehend. Standing before the restored Zero at Chiran, with its engine cowling polished to a gleam it likely never possessed in wartime, visitors confront a machine that embodies contradictions. It represents advanced engineering and suicidal desperation. It symbolizes individual courage and systemic madness. It is both artifact and argument, a silent participant in debates about war, memory, and the price of ideology that continue to this day. The kamikaze aircraft of World War II, those that survived destruction, serve now as monuments not to the war Japan fought, but to the war it lost, and the terrible human calculations made in losing's final chapter. They remind us that behind every technical specification, every tactical decision, every strategic calculation, stood young men who wrote last letters to families they would never see again. The machines have been preserved, the stories have been recorded, but the debates they provoke about nationalism, sacrifice, and the meaning of peace continue to echo through the decades, as relevant now as when those engines first fell silent in the summer of 1945. Thanks for watching this deep dive into what happened to Japan's Kamikaze planes after World War II. If you found this story compelling, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history's greatest conflict. Until next time, remember the past to understand the present.